Phil Phails at Philosophy. What the heck could it be? Life such a mystery. Phil Phails at Philosophy. Building who he wants to be. Living life in harmony. Phil Phails, conception, perception, reflection, knowledge, experience, experiment. What did he learn in college? Phil Phails at Philosophy. What the heck could it be? Life such a mystery. Phil Phails at Philosophy. Building who he wants to be. Living life in harmony. Phil Phails.
Welcome to Phil Phails. Phil Phails at Philosophy. We're here today with Grant Potts,
Professor of Philosophy, Religion, and Humanities at Austin Community College.
Going to the second part of this,
okay,
which is good. I get to put this down, and I'll invite you into a little thing that I've done every time, which is kind of like a little exercise in silliness to kind of separate us from the questions, and also I don't know, we'll do something together.
Silly?
Which will be just make weird gestures with your body maybe and with your face.
Yeah, that's my favorite lately is like when you can like shake your face enough that you
feel
can
your
feel
cheeks
jiggle and stuff.
I'll do it. I kind of get a sting
like
in my head when I do it.
Exactly.
So yeah.
I'll do that when I'm washing dishes sometimes.
You do?
Just to shake it up a little.
I love that. So that's kind of our break into the second part, which is, getting to know Grant Potts and how you became the Grant Potts you are now, and like your history and what brings a man to being a teacher of philosophy and the person that you are. Where were you born?
I was born in Liberia, in Harbel, Liberia.
Liberia.
In Africa.
In Africa.
Yeah.
Tell me about that. What were you doing? You seem like a white man. I'll say that. So, were you there at colonial?
Yeah, my dad worked for Firestone Tire and Rubber.
Okay.
Liberia was never colonized, but it was economically colonized by U.S. industry.
Okay. Yeah.
So, he was a project engineer, so kind of a project manager, but with engineering.
They were extracting rubber, or
there's a rubber plantation. And he was in charge of a big project to electrify the plantation.
I never think of, when I think of a plantation, I think of like growing cotton. I never thought of growing rubber.
Rubber trees, yeah.
They're rubber trees.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh my God. I thought this was like oil or something, but there's trees and they produce just like, instead of an apple, it's like a little tire.
Yeah, it's the sap of the rubber tree that's used.
Okay.
Yeah, and then, so he worked... he built a big dam
in Liberia. To provide electricity for the plantation.
For the plantation, yeah.
And you were, what was it like? How long were you there in your life?
We left when I was 2.
Okay.
To come back to the States, back to Akron, because Firestone was based out of Akron, although we lived in a suburb outside of Akron, Ohio.
Okay. And then you lived in Akron for?
Almost no time. We ended up after that in Maryland. I don't have a lot of memories of Maryland. I was actually talking to my wife about the fact that I'm not really sure how our house acquisition. I think we got the house that I grew up in later, between Liberia and Maryland, but I think he got put on another project in Maryland. That was like an 18-month project, I think. But we were there for a while. Those are my first memories. Maryland. One of my first memories is at the point where the Delaware River comes into the ocean. There's these places where all these horseshoe crabs come and congregate to breed or something. I don't know. But the beaches are just like swarming with horseshoe crabs. Whoa. And my parents took us there like one early morning when we lived in Maryland to see that. And it's like one of my earliest memories is that cool situation with all these horseshoe crabs. And then after that, my dad worked on a project in Bangkok, in Thailand.
Yeah.
So from 4 to 6, I was in Thailand.
Whoa.
And I have some memories of that. And then we came back to the States and lived in the house I think of as my childhood home. in Rittman, Ohio,
Okay.
which is it's a suburb of Akron. It's a small semi-rural industrial town, 7,000 people, a packaging plant, a salt mine, and a lot of cow farms.
Yeah.
So
When you say we, you're talking about your parents were married. They didn't get divorced.
No.
And it sounds like your dad was he building dams everywhere he went?
No, he was on I don't know what the Maryland project was in Thailand. He was working on an expansion of the actual. I think it was a factory that took the raw. I think it took the raw material of the rubber, and turned it into like usable rubber. Maybe they started doing some manufacturing for the tires themselves. He was on a number of other projects throughout the rest of my childhood, but just, American industry shifted how they treated overseas workers. Firestone was like many others, where moving your whole family is very expensive. So instead, what they started doing is like flying him to a project and having him work 3 weeks there and a week back, and 3 weeks there and a week back, which, was terrible. So it's just very disruptive to any real family life.
Yeah. I had that. My next question was like, what was your family life like? It sounds like your dad was probably always working, and your mom was probably more of the nurturer, but also the disciplinarian, because your dad was maybe. Yeah. What was your childhood like? What was your family like?
Yeah. No, I mean, it's very, very much that my dad was there. He was very much a provider. And I think he had a lot of good identity around that, of being, the stable force that provided the material.
He brought home the bacon
for the family. But because of this, my experience, which is different than my siblings who were older, right? So was when Firestone shifted how they did business, it had this big impact on me as a kid, because now my dad was gone 3 weeks. And sometimes it was like 6 weeks and a week back, like whatever the rhythm was.
But before that, your older siblings, y'all would all go to Liberia, or y'all would go to the
exactly.
Which kiddo are you?
I'm the youngest.
You're the youngest of
3.
Of 3,
right?
The baby.
Yeah. So that's So my father was there, but very distant, and so I have a relationship with him that is and it's interesting, because in some ways I feel like I have a better relationship with my father now that he's passed, and I'm kind of relating to him as an ancestor, because this sort of awkward distance of whether it was really needing to be that way, or it was the expectations that I should have, like this father force there, in a day-to-day way, was just not there for most of my life. And then, when he got back, he was not in the rhythm of the family.
He wanted to,
and he was often working long hours and staying late at the office anyway. And so, it's capitalism, man. It wrecks families.
Oh my God. So so we get an idea of the dad and how he plays a role in it. In his absence, what was it like? What were your siblings? Are they brothers, sisters?
Yeah, my brother was significantly older than me. He was 14 years older than me.
Okay.
So he was pretty distant as a figure in my life. Like, I have memories of him as an older brother that was present when we lived in Thailand. But even then, he ended up coming back to the States, I think at like 16 or 17, and living with my grandfather, and ended up going into the Air Force. And, he was always living at a distance from our family, in the long run. So I had this very distant relationship with him. And my sister is 4 years older than me, and so we had a much closer relationship.
What was it like so it was you and your sister, it sounds like, and then what was the dynamic between y'all and your mom?
I mean, my mom was a good mom.
What is a good
mom?
My
dad was a good dad. He just, he was just, by his circumstances, kind of pulled out of the household a lot. But yeah, no, she took care of us. She gave us, I don't know. I mean, I think she got that good balance of being there for us and setting a framework. And even though maybe many aspects of her value systems and whatnot, I would ultimately rebel against, but I think it's part of growing up, right? But she also did that then where she gave us a lot of appropriate autonomy as we matured as kids, right? She was very careful to like make sure that we had control over our lives, had ability to make decisions for ourselves, and learned how to do that.
Yeah.
I mean, she was an educator. She was a school teacher. Most of my memory of her is as a middle school teacher. Before my dad had gone to Liberia, well, the family had gone to Liberia before he got that assignment. He had worked in Akron, right, at the headquarters for Firestone were there in Akron. And she had been an elementary school teacher in the Akron city schools. And then when we came back, when we went overseas, she basically became a stay-at-home mom because it was very. I mean, she did some volunteering with education and with the museum groups and stuff like that, but mostly her focus was on trying to hold together a household living in Liberia or Bangkok, right? Temporarily. And she. So when we came back, I don't know how long it was. There was a period where she was still a stay-at-home mom, but pretty soon she started substitute. She got her license back in order with the state, started substitute teaching. By the time I was in middle school, she was full-time teacher in the middle school. In fact, I went to middle school in the same school she was teaching in, so we had to do that like weird navigation when your mom's one of the teachers in a small school.
Oh my God, yeah. You can't get away with anything.
No, I couldn't, but I could, partly because I think my mom had a good sense of being like, I need to let that kid get away with this, or else they're going to feel completely trapped, right? You know, so that's part of what I mean about that like sense of autonomy. She was really adept at that, and I appreciate that. So she did a good job of raising us. She put a strong emphasis on education, both as a teacher and you see as someone who became an educator. So it definitely was a regimented household, but not an overly regimented household. We ate together all the time unless there was some reason we couldn't. There was an expectation of like come home from school, take a short break, watch some cartoons, but by a certain point you do your homework until it's done, and then you can do other things. On Saturday mornings I had to make sure my room was completely clean before I could go enjoy myself, right? Those kinds of discipline foundations were there that I think were helpful, while also, making it finite enough of an expectation that I had plenty of time to be a kid.
Yeah, that sounds wonderful. Was there ever any, like, what was the relationship or the dynamic between your mom and dad? Was there ever any, like, emotional, like, trauma or any kind of, like, when I was growing up, there was always a lot of, like, cycle of violence in my household. There was a lot of, like, a dance of like yelling and escalating and kind of like calling each other names and stuff.
No, if anything, it was the opposite. There was almost like a household, and we're all of deep, long, Pennsylvania Dutch heritage, German blood.
What does that mean?
Like you don't talk about your own feelings, like like that. So if anything, like so to our benefit, we avoided a lot of that when there was conflict, but conflict was very silent and kind of put aside for, sometimes to the detriment of really addressing the problems that may need to be there. So yeah, I'd say their relationship was stoic. Loving, but stoic.
I never thought of like the pendulum swing or a binary where trauma's on both sides and one of them can be through lack of awareness or looking at or discussing conflict.
Right. And I would 100%, if there's going to be an error, I'd rather be on the error that's conflict avoidant.
Yeah.
So like, there's a whole set of issues to work through, but there are issues that don't involve actual violence. Yeah. So like,
Or like you never felt scared in the household.
I did at times. My dad used physical discipline with my brother and my sister. I don't have a good sense of how deep that was, but I do have very early memories of that physical discipline frightening the hell out of me.
Like spanking, or was it?
Yeah, that kind. Yeah. And I don't it's early enough that I don't have it all sorted out, right?
But you never were spanked.
I was, but it was rare, and my mom eventually just stopped it.
Your mom did it.
Yeah.
Oh, I remember when my mom spanked me, it was almost like the laughable. She would use one of those, those little games where you have a ball and you'd hit it, and it was always pretty
my mom
easy going.
never deployed physical discipline except once.
Yeah.
Because I think and it's sort of like, I mean, my belief is if you're deploying physical discipline, you've lost control.
Yeah.
Like that's just you've lost control of the situation. It's not a mark of good parenting.
Yeah.
It's not, I mean, you're a horrible parent, like you got to deal with the consequences, but, it means that you lost your shit.
Yeah.
And I think that's the way my mom related to it. So like, there's like one point where when I was very little and I was like going around the block and like running toward the street or something, like I was in physical danger through and she grabbed me and hit me and I don't even remember. My mom clearly remembers this as a traumatic experience because she talks about it. I don't even remember this except vaguely. So yeah, it had stopped by the time I was a kid, for which I'm thankful because I think physical discipline's awful.
Yeah. Two things come up for me about physical discipline that I'll share. And one was that when my dad would spank me, I did not like it. And it was painful. And he would do this thing where in between each, he would use a belt. In between each lash, or whatever you want to call it, he would say the word that was part of the discipline. Don't you ever. And I'm just like, goodness. And he was a lawyer. Right. So he would brevity wasn't his strong suit, but at that point I really wished it was. So he didn't do it much, but I remember the times that he did. I don't think he relished in it.
Right.
I also don't think that he was able to serve it cold, which I think if you're going to be able to do that, which I think this is impossible, you need to serve this discipline in an emotionalist state. You're not in an emotional state. You're not feeling anger or frustration. It is cold. It is exercising it. The other part of that actually involves Emerson. I remember the last time I spanked Emerson, we were living in Oxford, and we were in the family housing there. Mm-hmm. And I don't know what Emerson did, but I remember I wasn't delivering that discipline cold. Mm-hmm. There was passion and frustration. And I just remember as I was doing it, Emerson turned around and she reached her arms out, just wanting a hug or love. Right. And just saying it, I feel a lot of emotion and sadness because it's like, I think I could have gotten there through love and through connection, but for some reason I was not able to exercise those type of disciplinary techniques.
Yeah, exactly. The person who needs discipline is always you as the parent.
Oh yeah,
right. Yeah. And when we think about discipline that way, and I think you're right. Like if there was a justification for physical discipline, it should come from a space where you're making a good judgment that it's needed.
Yeah.
But I think if you actually examine what's going on, especially with just the wealth of psychological evidence of how damaging physical discipline is, especially when it's repeated over time, right? You would then realize physical discipline is not the right tool for this situation, right? I need to come up with a different way to get control of the situation, because sometimes you got to get control of the situation as a parent, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes we just don't have the tools to make that decision in the moment, right? And we lose our shit as parents, and then we have to be accountable to ourselves, our kids, and everyone else involved for making that decision. Yeah. But it doesn't So
one question that came up for me, you're a parent, I'm a parent, we're both parents. And I imagine you don't use physical discipline with your child. And I don't anymore. I think Emerson was the last time I spanked a kiddo. But I've had this question about what emotional abuse looks like, or how someone would look at their behavior and look at their relationships, and I don't know, from a philosophical realm or from any other framework we could use, how would one know that they're in an environment where, with physical abuse, it's easy. Mm-hmm. You punched somebody or you threatened with physical harm. That seems to be easy. How would you figure out emotional abuse?
I don't know. Yeah, I think that's hard.
Yeah.
It's hard. Because I think it's so messy and so complicated. and I think it often comes out of very human ways of trying to interact with each other that go sideways. Like I think in many emotionally abusive, like where you can see it's clearly emotionally abusive. Like sometimes it's just transparent. You're like, yeah, that is clearly emotional abuse, right? You know, like I think that there is even then. I mean, there are people, I think, who are like, I'm gonna totally emotionally abuse this person. I'm gonna mess them up. There are people like that. I think they're the rare human being. I think there are certain pathologies that lead to that, etc. But ultimately, for most of us that find ourselves in an emotionally abusive relationship, either where you're in, which is often the case in a relationship where the dynamic has led you to be very abusive with each other, or you are being abusive, or you're being abused, it emerges out of just things going sideways, right?
Yeah.
And no one made the decision for it to be that way.
Yeah.
If anything, we just didn't make the decision for it not to be that way along the way. So it's really important to ask, like, is this going that way? And can I make the decision to be different?
Yeah.
Right? I mean, I do think at that point, like, it's those basic signals, like, does what I am doing seem to contribute to healthy autonomy for the other person?
Yeah.
And for myself or not, right? And again, it's that question, like, what is the good life?
What is the good life?
Right?
Yeah.
And does the way I'm being is the way this person being with me, is the way I'm allowing this person to be with me contributing to a good life for both of us?
Yeah.
And then, is that at a state where I need to get out, or I need to, like, help this person get away from me, right? In whichever it is, like you see where that is, or is it a state where we need to introduce some real corrections for myself on?
Yeah.
Because the only person part of what makes relationships hard, right, is whether it's your kid or a friend or your boss or anyone, right?
Yeah.
There's only one person in the relationship you have any control over.
Oof.
Right?
Yeah.
And that's yourself.
Yeah.
Right? And so your choices are really limited to what can I do?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So in your childhood, it seems like there's very little physical discipline. And in your estimation, there doesn't seem like there was emotional abuse.
No, I've never felt, I mean, I'm not going to go into details because this might be on the internet when I did exist in an emotionally abusive relationship, right?
Okay.
Where I look back at that relationship and, of multiple years and say, I was being emotionally abused in that relationship, right?
So you've experienced
So
it.
I've experienced that, and I even my dad's distance, and
You could perceive that as some type of...
I don't feel like that experience of abuse with my family life.
Yeah.
Even my sister, who was like an older sister, so like, did all those older sibling things of making fun of you at the times when you're most vulnerable and all that stuff. Yeah, it all just feels like kind of normal sibling stuff, and not like, I mean, like in the moment, it's its own kind of trauma.
Right.
But it's not the same as people who have really gone through that kind of abuse as a kid.
So out of this nest, you go to... Where do you go to school?
Where did I go to school?
Yeah.
For my undergraduate work, I went to Denison University.
And that's in
Ohio, outside of Columbus, Ohio.
What'd you study? What were you excited about in college?
So
what was your life like?
And I should even get, like, I of course went to Wadsworth High School, right, and was there in high school in the town next to mine. There I started studying. I know as a high school kid, I was really, my mom was a math teacher.
Okay.
I was really good at math, right?
Yeah.
So I was just really positioned as a math nerd, right?
Yeah. Were you hanging out with nerds?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, I was playing D&D.
You still play D&D.
I still play D&D. And it was the time when D&D was totally for nerds and no one else. And I was into math and
Did you have a little crew? Like, how big was your nerd crew?
A little bit. Like, it's interesting because I had some at school and whatnot, but my tightest bonds really came around role playing, right? So I ended up with a group of guys who were my friend Brian's older brother's friends who had come back from military service.
Oh, so kind of older guys?
Yeah. So we just played a lot of D&D and a lot of Warhammer, which was like a miniature tabletop game. And sort of that was it. And then I had my crew and my debate team.
You were in debate.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
And then, so that was, and then eventually I met my friend Clay, who was just visiting. I mean, I knew him from freshman year, but we were talking about this the other night, that our friendship really came together because I had heard about these cool like book clubs where people like got together and talked about cool books.
Yeah.
And there wasn't something like that in my little town's high school or whatnot. So I went and at the local library started a book club.
You did?
Yeah.
That's so cool.
So we could read cool books. Most of the books we read were books that we understood as classics because they were the titles of Iron Maiden songs. So we read Strange in a Strange Land. We read, Loneliest of the Long Distance Runner. And so
I've got a funny question. I don't know if it's a funny question. If you had if a grouping of crows was called a murder of crows, what would a grouping of nerds be called?
I have no idea.
We need to have a name for them.
So anyways, I came out being math oriented.
Yeah.
I went to college. My mom was.
Was there any sports? Did you do any kind of sports ball?
I was a no, because I was a cross country runner.
You were okay.
Yeah.
It was running, which Emerson does.
Yeah.
Which
I loved it. Yeah.
You did.
Oh yeah.
Oh my goodness. So you come out. You've done math a ton. Your mom was a math.
Right.
So
and I wasn't very good at language arts. I wasn't good at that kind of. I mean, I wasn't bad.
Yeah.
But like. I was off the charts on math, and I was kind of a B student when it came to things like English.
Were you a big reader? Did you read a lot of books?
I read a lot of fantasy novels.
All of the Iron Maiden titles.
Right,
Yeah, right.
Exactly. And then the Iron Maiden titles. So that's when I started branching out into other things. There was, it's interesting how important certain kinds of resources are for kids to have that are just to find. Like, I think my ability to really embrace arts and culture and reading were deeply contributed by the fact that there was this really good used bookstore in Worcester, Ohio, that's still there in downtown. They had lots of like cheap copies of classic literature that I could get for 50 cents.
Do you remember what it's called? What the name of the bookstore is?
I was trying to remember. I can't remember.
Okay.
I can't remember. And then the fact that like when I was in high school, the Cleveland Museum of Art, which is one of the best museums in the country, is a free museum.
Yeah.
So as middle-class kids without a lot of extra resources, we would drive up there and go to the museum as a way of hanging out, right?
Yeah.
And so keeping those kinds of free resources is really important, I think, to cultivate that. But anyway, so I like that kind of stuff. But I went to college with the intent. I even chose to a good degree where I was going on who had good math programs.
You were going into math.
And never took a math class beyond a computer science class when I was in college. Because I tested out of my like general education math.
Okay.
And started doing my general education because it was a liberal arts school and started studying. I was also starting to get into mythology and
you
Joseph
did philosophy, or you did theology, right?
No, well, I was getting into Joseph Campbell and kind of comparative mythology in high school.
Okay.
And so when I got there, I talked to the religion program, which was a kind of hybrid religious studies theology program.
Okay.
And I was like, I think I want to study English literature because I was getting into that. And I was so I ended up in a class called The Bible and Ovid in English Literature. The Bible and Ovid in English Literature, which was just looking at how sort of Greek mythology and the mythology in the Hebrew Scriptures and the New Testament end up being part of literature through English literature.
Interesting.
And then a Hebrew Scriptures class, right? And those were kind of, those two classes probably are what fundamentally reshaped what I wanted to study. So I ended up studying English literature and religion as an undergraduate.
Wow. From math
right
to from like hard science.
Like I took like my first semester, or maybe it was my first year, I took Pascal. And which was the programming language at that time that they taught you on. It was very math oriented. It was very much rooted in also doing the math around matrices and a lot of other forms of discrete math. But I that was the only math class I took, because I started taking these other classes and just started following those channels. But the school I ended up to, that was their model. Like, they really discouraged you from having a major. I don't even think we were allowed to declare a major our first year. I may be wrong about that, but
They wanted you to figure it out and explore things
for a year or two and then settle into a major.
I love that.
No, it was. I think it's a superior way of organizing a curriculum to our, like, get a major, get through as fast as you can,
Get a job, industrialization,
Yeah.
get on the line.
So so then that's what I studied. I graduated with that bachelor's. I went and worked for a bank, for Bank One.
How did those skills relate to banking?
In the way all good liberal arts degrees,
Social.
yeah, like
Cultural.
social, cultural understanding, problem solving, communication, like all those things, and having that within the context of seeing all of that, not just as this isolated set of skills, but as part of being a person that is in a history of being people.
Yeah.
That goes back.
You were a teller?
No.
What'd you do?
I worked in the credit card industry, customer service, some moderate fraud investigation, that kind of stuff, some dispute resolution, because some of that was things we were allowed to do as you moved up in the customer service area. Like, increasingly, even when I was there, that was being siloed off into these various divisions. Yeah, it was good. I mean,
Did you like it?
I loved it. I could go to my job, do it well, come home, not think about it, and and I also thought it was, like, totally fundamentally meaningless. So
Were you a philosopher at this time?
no. I knew I was pretty sure I wanted to study more.
You did?
The graduate school, like, all my friends were kind of like, my close friends in my program were kind of geared towards going to graduate school. I think my faculty, who were my mentors, were disappointed, but I was also on this trajectory of school. Right?
You needed a break?
And I just I was like, I don't know if I want to do that. Right. I don't like, my life was being just sort of unfolding in a pattern that I didn't know. Right. So my senior year of college, I just sabotaged it. I just refused to do anything around going to graduate school or even take my GREs or any of those types of things. I mean, I also, this isn't the same relationship I was talking about. I was in a relationship with someone who had another year of school. So part of it was wanting to stick around and just work for a year while she was completing. But yeah, so I did that. I liked working for the bank as a job. It was a good job, but it was a job that was fundamentally not tied to what I wanted to do with my life.
Right.
And yeah, at a certain point, I decided to go back to school.
What was that message? Like, how did you get that? How did that change come? The idea that...
I think it just was there. And finally I was like, yeah, I don't think this is what I want to do. I think school is what I want to do, which I think was helpful, because grad school is an ordeal. Like, especially if you get a PhD.
Yeah.
As I think you probably, at least even being on the ancillary of that, understand.
Oh, yeah.
I actually believe if I had gone from my bachelor's degree into graduate school without having an experience of working out in the world for a while and paying my bills and knowing that that I could do that, right? And have a at least moderately content life, right? That when I hit some of the big trials that are inevitably there in graduate school, I would have said, fuck this noise, right? But the fact that I had made the choice to do that I knew that I wanted to be there, was what provided me with the resilience to say, I chose to be here. There's a reason I want to be here. I'll get through this.
Yeah.
You know?
And that was the job. You knew you didn't want that. You didn't want to go back to that. So there was some resilience there that came from working at the bank, and I'm not really exactly clear on what it is.
It's not that I didn't want to go back. I mean, part of it was like, I knew if I had to go back to work a meaningless job that could pay my bills and allow me to enjoy life outside of that would be fine.
Yeah.
Right? That's cool.
But you were willing to do the arduous task,
Right, because I knew that what I really wanted was this, right?
Yeah, and you studied.
So I went to Arizona State in Tempe.
Is that a party school?
Yeah, it kind of was.
Did you party there?
Probably. I mean,
I don't know
not
anything
really.
about this.
Like, I mean, not in the way other people were partying.
Yeah,
It
yeah.
was like a like drinking party school.
Yeah.
And I was much more in the like weird people taking acid
Yeah.
and sitting around fires in their backyard party scene, which is more compatible with graduate study because like, you know, you do it like once a week and then you spend the rest of the week really with your nose to the books.
That might be the difference between undergrad and graduates.
Right.
Like,
Yeah, I think so. I think that's part of it. It's like you can't, even if you're at a party school as a graduate student, you can't succumb to that except as an occasional weekend experience, right?
yeah, I think you touched on something I'd like to talk about, and that's like the relationship psychedelics has had in your life, and maybe in your thinking and the role it's played, if any.
Yeah, you're like, you said you took acid. Let me
Yeah,
ask
I'm
you.
not saying that it did. I know that
So I want to know about the psychedelic.
in the current zeitgeist, this is definitely a topic that I think people
Yeah.
find fascinating or there's interest in it. So if we talked about it some, I think some folks might be interested
Yeah,
in it.
no, it is. I mean, it's really, it is definitely deeply formative for who I am to have been, you know. So as it was really my heaviest use of psychedelics was when I was working at the bank.
Really?
I mean, that was part of what was like great about it is like I could go to work and I'd be done and I could just take lots of acid all weekend.
What
right?
is lots of acid? Like
Like a couple hits or, you know, maybe
Yeah.
2 nights in a row, but every weekend, right? You
yeah,
know?
every
And,
weekend. Goodness.
yeah. So
Tell me about that.
Like, so, yeah. And so, well, I mean, that's just what my life was. Like I would work at the bank and do a good job and then
Yeah.
go visit my friends in southeastern Ohio and play drums and like hang out in the middle of the countryside.
Yeah.
And yeah. So, and think about things and have good conversations and all the things that are there with that culture.
How was it formative, or how did it change you?
I think it formed me in a lot of ways. Like one, it allowed me to have certain kinds of transportational experiences that you don't walk away from unchanged.
Oh yeah.
You know, and sometimes in bad ways and sometimes in good ways. And part of it is also like, because of that, it's almost this like hyper laboratory for that kind of intensive experience. Like in, you know, sometimes if you have a bad trip,
Yeah,
right,
that's what I was thinking.
how do you recover from that? How
Yeah.
do you put your world back together? Right, becomes this interesting skill set when you have like a disintegration in your life later, right? Like how do you put your world back together?
Yeah.
As well as the kind of like really interesting connections between ways of understanding the world or understanding the people around you. So I think, you know, in one way it was formative in opening me up to a whole host of ways of understanding things that I didn't have. And in others, by helping me understand how easy it is to delude yourself, right? You know, like, and just go with that for a long time.
Yeah. Did you ever have, when I read, what was it? Michael Pollan's book, he talks about a certain percentage of folks who do psychedelics have a deeply spiritual experience.
Definitely. No, I definitely had a number of deeply spiritual experiences.
Yeah.
You know, some were just like, you know, moon watching. And, you know, I think it depends on what we mean, but I think what he talks about and what people often mean is that kind of oceanic sense of connection or deep insight.
Yeah.
Yeah. And yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I remember this one time I just like, I, you know, you had that moment where you're kind of disconnected, like truly in a truly psychedelic experience, right?
Yeah.
Where you're disassociated and in the trip. And I had this sort of like crazy experience where I kind of blew out into the solar system And then the Egyptian god Thoth was there talking to me, and we were talking about the nature of time. And I was totally neurotic around time, and I still somewhat am, but he was just like, I release you from time. And then like I came, and ever since then I've been a lot more chill about time. Than I'm still pretty neurotic, but I don't have panic attacks when I'm late for things. So
I release you from time.
So like from that to just sort of, like the kind of like, more like, I feel connected to everything and accepted by the universe.
Yeah, some universal oneness.
Right,
Yeah.
So I think it taught me paths to that kind of thing and understanding the role of that thing and the value of that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. So then you're at Arizona State.
Right. So
you're studying.
I studied religious studies. I got a master's degree there. It was a program that was really focused on the cultural study of religion. So really it got, because I'd had a good sort of literary, historical and theological training around religion with some introduction to kind of more anthropological and sociological ways of understanding religion as an undergraduate. And I got a lot heavier of the social scientific approaches to religion while I was at Arizona State. And they had, it was a pretty big program. It was master's only. And I was getting a master's. So the nice thing when you're at a master's only program as a master's student, as opposed to getting a master's degree in a program with PhD students, is all the faculty actually spend a lot more time with you because they wish you were their PhD students, but they don't have PhD students, right? So you get the kind of mentoring you typically don't get until you're in the PhD stage.
Yeah.
And it was big, and there were a lot of good people doing things. It wasn't intentionally comparative. I mean, I guess it was, but in the study of religion, you're often focused on traditions. Like you either are like someone who studies Buddhism or someone who studies Christianity or whatnot. But the way they organized their seminars were topical. So we had like a seminar on sacred space or collective memory.
And then comparative means they're looking at that topic across multiple different.
So they would give us a lot of stuff that was more theoretical conversations about that. But each of us were working in our own area. So as graduate students, we were bringing our area to the conversation. So it ended up being, just by virtue of that, comparative. And so that was a great education. I ended up writing a thesis on the development of esoteric Freemasonry in the 18th century.
If you were to tell a layman about your thesis, someone like me, how would you explain it?
Well, what I was trying to figure out is how you go from people who, at least as best we understand it, if there is a history of craft masonry, we're building stuff with bricks, to the Knights Templar. Right? How do you go there?
Yeah.
And I was particularly interested in the way that happened because of the way increasingly privileged classes of people who were not, the traditional privileged classes prior to that are really the clergy and the aristocracy, but these developing, basically merchant class, for lack of a better word. And new aristocracy, and people who are developing as what becomes.
Does that mean new money? Are you saying like new?
Yeah,
money?
It's new money, but it's before there's like new money.
Right.
They are the original new money.
This is the merchant class.
Right. Yeah, this is who becomes the old money eventually.
And that's what allowed.
But they're figuring out new ways to socialize with each other and new ways to understand what they're doing, and that's what allowed sort of the development of Freemasonry as this kind of social club. And then how does that become this esoteric thing that, in terms of the esoteric dimensions of Freemasonry that form the background to a lot of modern New Age, esoteric, occult thought, those types of things.
Yeah.
And so I was trying to figure that out. And basically what I argued was that the idea of the Mason, because it has no real meaning, right, at the time of a builder, right, becomes this sort of category that all sorts of people can project what they want this new world to look like out of, right? And feel like they're participating in a common project together, even though many of them are doing different things. Like it's a kind of floating signifier that can pick up whatever meaning you need it to have. So that's the basic argument of that piece. And it was interested in that, and it also just got me to be able to look at a lot of the history of Freemasonry, and I had kind of wanted to continue that. So I applied to a number of PhD programs. Where I went eventually was the University of Pennsylvania.
Wait, slow down. Did you get an A?
I think.
Nice.
It's like
You seem like an A
grades
student.
are less of a thing in graduate school.
I'm just kidding.
No, but yeah, I mean, it's like everybody, like if you're not getting an A, they ask you to leave the
should
program.
get out of here.
Yeah, exactly.
And another thing I have is like, it seems like your thesis is just an extension of your D&D.
To some extent, yes. Yeah, no, exactly. No, and my interest in religion was like
Really?
Comes out of, I think, the fantasy novels, exploration of religion, and these kind of alternate social worlds. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And so you applied to a number of PhD programs.
Right, but I got into several, and Penn was one of the places I really wanted to go. And part of why I wanted to go was because I wanted to study with Peg Jacobs, who is a historian of the Enlightenment who focuses on Freemasonry. But between when I applied and when I got there, she got hired out by UCLA.
Oh,
So
she wasn't there when you got there.
But my interest was shifting. I was interested in Freemasonry as a ritual culture, how they develop these rituals, what that means, what it means to have this kind of ritual culture. So by the time I got to Penn, I ended up focusing on ritual as my focus of study, just more generally. And so yeah, at Penn, that's a much more kind of old school. At that time, it isn't as much anymore. Text study style of scholarship on religion.
Okay.
Right. What Penn was known for is their Sanskritists, and they're people who develop ways to organize and understand Greek papyri to understand the Christian scriptures better, right? Like those kinds of...
So very different from Arizona State.
Right, it was. Those resources were there in other departments, and I drew on them. And I was officially in modern religious thought as the area of focus. But what I was interested in is how basic... And it's still one of the things I'm really interested in, how are basic categories we use to understand things like religion, in this case, ritual. Yeah. These are categories that have a history, right? The word ritual doesn't come until pretty late as people would talk about ceremony or rites, right, or sacraments, but those mean different than what we mean. It's really a term that developed with the social sciences as a way to describe these kinds of behaviors we see with things we call religion, right? So how did we develop that category? What went into that? What did we understand about the things we were trying to understand? What did we stop understanding because we started putting it in this box? What happens when we put things in this kind of box or that kind of box? That's ultimately what leads me to an interest in philosophy. Yeah. So I was studying in religious studies still, but I was increasingly interested in how we develop these kinds of categories, whether it's Mason or ritual or anything else. Even basic categories like light or right. These aren't things that are just there. We can come up with definitions that also, well, that's what we mean by light. But when we use the term light, it has this whole world of meaning. Right. That isn't just light waves. Right. Yeah. These are categories by which we organize our world. How do we make a world? How do we make a world collectively? How do we share in that world? How do we structure our behaviors around those ideas? How does that help us become human and lead a good life?
And you got interested in that in Penn.
Yeah. So I started studying philosophy, and through my formal graduate training, my study of philosophy was almost purely as an ancillary to methodological problems in interpreting religion. Right. So these were questions about these categories because I was interested in how these kind of fundamental categories, the sacred, ritual, etc.
So if I understand that correctly, philosophy was a way to better study religion.
Right. As a scholar of religion, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, that's what got me interested in philosophy. I would have never identified as a philosopher at that point.
No. Were you one though? In hindsight, when did you become a philosopher?
As much as anyone is, yeah, sure. So
yeah,
we're all born with that to some extent.
Yeah.
But I yeah. So when I finished there, the trajectory, someone coming from an Ivy League R1,
Yeah.
graduate program is you're going to go become a researcher at an R1 school. Right?
Okay.
And so that was the trajectory I was on and looking at. I kind of was not sure if that's what I wanted to do. I got to teach as a graduate student. I found I loved that.
You love teaching.
Yeah, I loved teaching.
Yeah.
And that's what I really wanted to do. And so I started thinking about that way. And if you're an academic and you really want to focus on teaching for real, you got two paths. You got small liberal arts school like where I went,
Yeah.
or community colleges.
Yeah.
There still is, but I think it's less. There was a strong stigma around community colleges that if you went and taught at a community college, it was because you failed, right? You couldn't get a job somewhere else, right?
Yeah.
Which is a narrative I still combat because I think some of the most important academic work being done right now in terms of the real work of developing an academic understanding, a value of understanding how academic tools help us understand our world and live good lives, right? Happens at community colleges. So yeah, I came out of that and was trying to find a job. Right? The academic job market is always,
Oh my God. Yeah.
all the time, terrible, no matter what discipline,
Yeah.
no matter what. Everyone always says,
Well, the more niche
things are different now, right? Yeah, the more niche you are, sort of, but the people who weren't,
four people that
the
are
people who I knew who weren't that niche were just, they had more people to compete with, right?
Oh, yeah.
The percent of jobs is about the same, right?
Right.
But yeah, I'm in a discipline that because I was in the American Academy of Religion, which is where most of the hiring happened at that time, and I was a graduate representative there. I knew the data. We would typically have 200 full-time positions, tenure track style positions a year
Oh God.
in the world, right?
How many of those are opening up to new folk? Yeah.
Right, exactly. So yeah, it is. But there were only, there's a very small number of religious studies PhDs produced a year, right? So, which is bigger than the need, right? Because that's how markets work.
Right.
Yeah, so I came out and I was in the job market. It was 2008, and in 2008, as you may know, there was a collapse of the housing market around subprime mortgages.
Yeah.
It impacted endowments at colleges.
Oh, yeah.
Significantly. The year I went on the market.
That impacted all the liberal arts more than it did the hard sciences too, if I recall correctly.
Yeah, I don't remember. I just know that we went from having 200 jobs posted to 60. In that year.
Same number of folks looking to get a job.
I was
too.
in a good job interview experience at a smaller art school, and I think I was already working for St. Ed's here. And I remember getting a call from the program and being like, "Oh, they're calling. This is the offer." And she was like, so we walked into the provost's office ready. She didn't say it was me or whoever it was. They were down to 3 candidates to talk about hiring the person we wanted to hire. And he told us we were freezing all
Oh my goodness.
So that was the story everywhere. So I came out at an interesting time. I had done writing tutoring, and writing support in a variety of ways, and been trained as a writing teacher at Penn as part of my teaching training. So as I was coming out of graduate school, right, when I was getting my PhD, because the year I went on the market was after, in all seriousness, was I had gotten a job at St. Edward's as a coordinator of their online writing lab.
Okay.
So it's good. I knew I wanted to work in the academic world.
Right.
Right. Ideally as a professor, but I just wanted to be part of the system that was contributing to that education.
Yeah.
Right. So I liked that job. I mean, it wasn't the best paid, and and I also wanted to teach, and there were certain classes at St. Ed's I wanted to teach, but they had this rule where if you were a staff member, you couldn't teach because they were afraid of being, I think it's because they were afraid of being sued for overtime, as an adjunct.
Yeah.
So ultimately I ended up connecting both at ACC to teach religion classes and at St. Ed's to teach classes there. Quit that job so I could teach at St. Ed's, and made the leap into kind of adjunct world, and then ended up pretty quickly getting a full-time position at ACC.
Yeah.
And the rest is history. And it's there that I began to, I had gotten interested in philosophy methodologically.
Right, at Penn.
And I was in a program that was a philosophy program that also had, it's philosophy, religion, humanities, but at that time especially it was philosophy with some humanities and like 2 religion classes.
Okay.
And I kind of knew like, if I'm gonna be here long term, full time, if I was gonna get that full time job when it came up, I would need to be able to teach philosophy. So I had philosophy credits of graduate philosophy classes.
Yeah.
Like when we hire someone to teach something, typically in a community college, for our accreditors, like if I wanted you to come teach philosophy, you would need to have a master's degree in philosophy or a master's degree in something and 18 graduate hours in philosophy.
Okay.
So I went and got some additional graduate hours at Texas State in philosophy.
Nice.
And which was good, solid master's only program. It's one of those places where like I advise students, if you want to go to a master's only program and leap from there, it's a good place to go. And I, so I picked up those extra credits, studied there, studied some things that I'd done. I was interested a lot in, my other big interest had been environmental spirituality, and particularly Gaia theory and how Gaia theory was used by different spiritual communities.
What is Gaia theory?
Like the idea that it goes back to this theory by James Lovelock, who was a scientist who put forth this idea that understanding the global climate ecosystem, the whole global ecosystem, is best understood by understanding it as an organism.
And Gaia is a word for
Gaia
God
is the word,
or Earth or
Gaia
Mother
is
Earth
is an old term for Earth. And so he used the term Gaia.
Gaia theory.
To say, if we think of ourselves as living on an organism called Gaia, we can understand global processes better.
I like
and
that.
And there's debates about whether that's a good theory or not, to think of it as an organism, whether it fits the criteria of an organism. But it's one of those things that restructures at a very important time how people think about things like climate as global processes. But it also was very influential on contemporary pagan communities, certain forms of ecofeminist Christian thought. So like I was interested in like how these different communities talk to each other. So, so I got to take what I had always wanted to take, an environmental ethics class while I was at Texas State, some good stuff on social and political philosophy I hadn't had yet, and just kind of round out my knowledge so that I could start teaching philosophy. But I am someone who, like, if I think of myself as a philosopher, I became a philosopher by teaching philosophy. Not because I got a PhD in philosophy, right?
Yeah.
And I learned what it was to be a philosopher very much by being confronted with the responsibility of helping these undergraduates understand what philosophy it is and what it is to be a philosopher.
That's beautiful. There's that saying that if you want to learn something, you read about it. If you want to, what's that thing where read, write, teach? It's like if you want to, I don't remember it, but
I think
to master something, you teach it.
Right. No, I think that it is true. There is a level at which, like, because if you're going to do it well, right? If you're going to have care, right? You're not going to be careless about it. You gotta take that responsibility to be like, oh, I gotta really get my head around this.
Yeah.
And there's a way in which, you read something. You're like, okay, I understand that. You want to try to write it out and communicate it to someone else. You have to put it together another way. But if you want to like do that in a way that
and take all questions, all comers, and answer questions about it, that's a whole nother level of mastery.
So maybe to go back to your earlier question, how do I know if I'm failing philosophy? Like, or how do I start failing philosophy? Well, you got to read, you got to write some,
and then you got to teach a little bit.
You got to teach a little bit.
So now you are a philosopher now. Would you say you're a philosopher?
Sure. Yeah. I usually feel comfortable presenting myself as a philosopher and a scholar of religion, and more generally a scholar of humanities.
And I would imagine you're living the good life.
I love my life.
Yeah. And when you define value or good, how do you do it?
I see what you're saying. Yeah. Yeah.
I would think like it's in the garden. The way that
Yeah,
you,
no, it is. It
Yeah.
is. It is. I mean, that is my primary metaphor in spiritual practice, right?
Yeah.
Is cultivation of a living world around me, whether that's my students,
Yeah.
or the organization of the college,
Or the
my
literal
coworker,
garden in your
or the little
backyard.
garden in my backyard. Yeah,
Cultivation is value
yeah, a cultivation of life.
of life.
Yeah, because and that is, I love the garden because, and I'm a reckless gardener, right? You know, like
What is that like?
I mean, it's great, but I mean, I think what helped. This was in grad school. I really started gardening at community gardens.
Okay.
In Philadelphia, because there was a community garden right outside my first apartment.
Mm-hmm.
And I was feeling like, I mean, remember I grew up in semi-rural Ohio.
Yeah.
I went to Denison, was in a rural space.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I lived in Tempe, but that was like I was trying to get away from that.
Yeah.
The thing that made me not want to go to Penn was the fact that it was in this urban area. And then
You wanted to be in a rural area.
Then I'm in West Philadelphia, right?
Oh, God. Yeah. Yeah.
And it's very urban, and I'm just like, and so there was a little community garden outside, and I had done some gardening with my mom.
Yeah.
And there was some gardening when I was in college, but not seriously. And that's where I started gardening. And I remember one of the old gardeners in that community gardener was just like, well, you know, if you're going to garden, the first thing you got to do is just accept that you're going to kill a lot of plants. And if you're not a bad gardener because you're killing plants, you're just a gardener who hasn't learned how to do it, right?
Oh, yeah,
Right,
yeah. You're failing
Right.
at gardening and you're learning.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's
You're growing.
right.
Literally.
And so that's how I started, right? But it's still my approach. Like I still like, what is this plant? I'll do a little bit of reading about it. Let's put it there and see how it goes. Like,
Yeah. I love that.
and a lot of things die and other things grow, but that's also kind of how the plant world works, right?
Yeah.
I'd probably be more careful about not killing things if they were animals.
Yeah.
You know, like I think, but the plant world is more of the foundational ecology, and
Yeah. I think
death is much more of a plant's life.
Yeah.
And compost, like being part of that is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm going to check with Emerson. How are we doing? I feel like I'm in a time vortex with you. I could talk to you probably for all night. And
Yeah, it's 5:15.
yeah. How do you, we probably should start to wrap it up.
Yeah,
What kind of things, how should we wrap it up?
I don't know. It's up to you. It's your show.
Yeah. Well, I think what I'd do is I would share how delightful it is to spend time with you.
Yeah.
It always is. I've always enjoyed our time together, learning from you and talking BS and talking in more, intellectual spaces. I said the same thing to Bob Peck, another man that I talked with. When I'm around you and I speak with you, I feel smarter and dumber at the same time in the most endearing or it's a compliment. Yeah. Areas where I can grow, and also I feel like in some ways you're a peer of mine.
Yeah, I mean, yeah.
So I want to just thank you so much for coming on and talking, and I would love to talk to you again. We'll see how all this comes, but I think I could continue this discussion for another 2 hours.
If not here, we can just talk without microphones too.
Yeah, in the backyard around the fire. So everybody, really a lot of thanks for Grant Potts. If you want to learn philosophy from him, ACC.
Yeah, go to ACC.
Go learn from this
or
man.
from the other 30 people who are brilliant there who teach philosophy.
Absolutely. Yeah, wonderful. Thank you so much, Grant.
All right, take care.
Yeah.